The afternoon of September 12, 1944. Kummersdorf Proving Ground, 40 kilometers south of Berlin. Hauptmann Ernst Hoffman watched as the ordnance technician lifted the American rifle from the wooden crate. The weapon was heavier than he expected, 9.5 pounds, perhaps 10, and bore the scars of combat. Mud still caked in the receiver grooves. Someone had scratched tally marks into the walnut stock. 7 marks. 7 men, Hoffman supposed, or 7 days, or 7 reasons why German infantry were dying faster than they could be replaced in the hedgerows of Normandy. The technician worked the bolt with a mechanical efficiency that suggested he'd already become familiar with this particular specimen. It moved smoothly. Too smoothly. No Mauser had ever cycled like that, not after 3,000 rounds, not after the frozen winters of the Ostfront, certainly not after being pulled from the mud of France with its previous owner still clutching it. Serial number 309467. The technician read aloud, noting it in the log. Captured at Saint-Lô. Springfield Armory Manufacture, 1942. Condition: serviceable. He paused, running his thumb along the gas cylinder. More than serviceable, Herr Hauptmann. Pristine internal components despite field use. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hoffman had seen dozens of captured weapons pass through this facility. French rifles that jammed in cold weather, Russian submachine guns that worked brilliantly but required ammunition nobody could spare, British Enfields that were solid, reliable, and entirely unremarkable. This American rifle troubled him in a way none of the others had. It wasn't supposed to exist, not in this form, not in these quantities. Wehrmacht intelligence had known the Americans were developing a self-loading rifle since the mid-30s, but the assumption, the comfortable certainty that had guided German small arms doctrine, was that such weapons were too expensive, too complex, too prone to malfunction for mass production. The Americans would issue them to specialists, perhaps elite units. But the standard infantryman? Impossible. The crate at Hoffman's feet contained 12 more, all captured within a single week, all from ordinary infantry units, all functional. The technician inserted a clip. They called it an en-bloc clip, a strange system where the entire cartridge holder went into the rifle's receiver and 8 rounds of 30-06 ammunition disappeared, into the weapon with a metallic snap. The bolt slammed forward on its own. No manual manipulation required. Ready to fire. Hoffman had read the initial reports from the front. Company commanders describing American riflemen who could maintain suppressive fire without the pauses inherent to bolt-action weapons. Platoon leaders noting that German infantry, armed with their Karabiner 98 Kurs rifles, were managing perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute in optimal conditions. The Americans, according to these reports, were achieving double that. Some claimed triple. The Kar 98K was a masterpiece of bolt-action design, accurate out to 400 meters, reliable in the worst conditions, built on the proven Mauser action that had served Germany since before the Great War. 5 rounds, loaded from a stripper clip. Each shot required the soldier to unlock the bolt, pull it back, push it forward, rotate it down, aim again, fire again. It had been sufficient in Poland, adequate in France, even effective, when properly supported by machine guns, in Russia. But that was before the Americans arrived with this. The rifle sat on the test bench between them, unremarkable in appearance yet radiating a quiet threat that Hoffman felt in his chest. 8 rounds without touching, the bolt. Semi-automatic fire as fast as a man could pull the trigger, and according to intelligence estimates, the Americans had produced over 3 million of them. Begin the tests, Hoffman said. To understand what troubled Hauptmann Hoffman that September afternoon required understanding what he and the entire Wehrmacht believed about infantry warfare. This belief was not theoretical. It had been tested across 6 years of war, refined through victories in Poland and France, hardened in the crucible of the Russian front. German infantry doctrine centered on a fundamental principle. The rifle was not the primary killing weapon of the infantry squad. That role belonged to the machine gun, the MG-34, and its successor, the MG-42. These were the true instruments of suppressive fire, capable of cycling 1,200 rounds per minute. The rifleman's job was to protect the machine gunner, to provide accurate fire at identified targets, and to conserve ammunition for critical moments. This philosophy shaped every aspect of German small arms development. The Kar-98K was deliberately designed as a precision instrument, not a volume weapon. Its bolt-action mechanism, descended from the Gewehr 98 that had served in the Great War, prioritized accuracy and reliability over rate of fire. A trained German soldier could chamber approximately 15 rounds per minute, sufficient for aimed fire at individual targets, woefully inadequate for sustained suppression. But this limitation was acceptable, even logical, within the doctrinal framework. Machine guns provided suppression, riflemen provided precision. The system worked. It had worked spectacularly in 1939 and 40, when German forces overran Poland and France with a speed that shocked the world. The Americans, German planners believed, approached warfare differently, wastefully. American industrial capacity meant they could afford to expend ammunition at rates that would bankrupt the Reich. Their semi-automatic rifles, when rumors of them first reached Berlin in the late 1930s, were dismissed as yet another example of American excess. Why give an ordinary soldier a weapon that could fire 8 rounds in rapid succession when he lacked the discipline to use those rounds effectively? The Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Agency, had examined the concept of self-loading rifles before the war. Walther and Mauser had both developed prototypes. The Gewehr 41, introduced in 1941, represented Germany's first serious attempt at a semi-automatic infantry rifle. But production remained limited. Fewer than 150,000 were manufactured before it was replaced by the Gewehr 43, which itself never achieved mass distribution. By late 1944, the overwhelming majority of German infantry still carried the Kar-98K. This was not mere conservatism. The Mauser was cheaper to produce, roughly 67 Reichsmarks per unit, compared to perhaps double that for a self-loading rifle. It required less raw material at a time when steel and other metals were desperately scarce. Most critically, it consumed less ammunition, a consideration that grew more urgent with each passing month as Germany's logistical situation deteriorated. The decision to prioritize the machine gun and stick with bolt-action rifles for the masses was, within its own context, entirely rational. The German squad, organized around its MG team, had proven devastatingly effective from Warsaw to Stalingrad. Why fix what wasn't broken? But the Americans had made a different calculation. Rather than accepting the bolt-action rifle as sufficient for all but machine gunners, they had given every rifleman a weapon that could approach machine gun rates of fire while retaining rifle accuracy. The M1 Garand, adopted as the standard American service rifle in 1936, 2 years before Germany, standardized, the Kar-98K represented a fundamental philosophical difference in how infantry combat should be conducted. And now, in September 1944, as German forces retreated on every front, Hauptmann Hoffman stood in a testing facility, holding physical evidence that perhaps the Americans had been right. The technical specifications of the M1 Garand told only part of the story. The weapon was chambered in .30-06 Springfield, the American designation for a 7.6 2 by 63 mm cartridge, a powerful round comparable to Germany's own 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser. The rifle weighed 9.5 pounds empty, about the same as the Kar-98K. Its effective range extended to roughly 500 yards, again comparable to the German infantry rifle. On paper, the two weapons seemed nearly equivalent. But the M1's gas-operated, semi-automatic action transformed what those specifications meant in practice. Where a German rifleman needed nearly 4 seconds to cycle his bolt-action rifle between shots, an American soldier could fire all 8 rounds from his Garand in under 10 seconds, and that assumed aimed fire, not panic shooting. The implications rippled outward from that single technical difference. A German infantry section of 10 men, 8 armed with Kar-98K rifles and 2 with an MG-42 machine gun, could theoretically deliver approximately 100 rifle rounds per minute, plus the machine gun's devastating but ammunition-hungry fire. An equivalent American infantry squad, with all 8 riflemen armed with Garands, could deliver over 300 rifle rounds per minute while still having their Browning automatic rifle and machine gun held in reserve. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Normandy described the effect in stark terms. German soldiers, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, reported being unable to effectively maneuver under the volume of fire American units could maintain. The sound of Garand fire a distinctive, rapid cracking punctuated by the metallic ping when the empty en-bloc clip ejected had become as psychologically devastating as the actual rounds themselves. It suggested an enemy with inexhaustible ammunition and an almost mechanical ability to maintain suppression. What made this particularly galling was that the Germans had encountered self-loading rifles before. The Soviets had fielded the SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle in significant numbers during the early years of the Ostfront, but Soviet production had faltered, and the rifles themselves proved temperamental in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. German forces had captured hundreds of thousands of them. Some were pressed into service with Wehrmacht units, but they never achieved the reputation for reliability that would have made them preferable to the Kar-98K. The Americans, somehow, had solved the reliability problem. Reports from the field indicated that the M1 Garand functioned in mud, in cold, in the dust and heat of North Africa and the jungles of the Pacific. More incredibly, it continued functioning after minimal maintenance. German soldiers who captured Garands and test-fired them reported that the weapon's gas-operated system seemed almost impervious to the fouling and debris that would disable a Gewehr 43. General Patton had allegedly called the M1 the greatest battle implement ever devised. Hoffman didn't know if the quote was authentic or Allied propaganda. But standing in the proving ground that afternoon, examining a rifle that had survived combat conditions that would have rendered many German weapons inoperative, he understood the sentiment. The Japanese, intelligence reports suggested, were so impressed by captured Garands that their Yokosuka naval arsenal had begun reverse engineering the design. Production details were scarce, but the fact that Japan, facing its own desperate shortage of raw materials and manufacturing capacity, would dedicate resources to copying an American weapon, spoke to the M1's impact. Germany had not attempted to copy the Garand. The industrial capacity and raw materials required were already committed to other weapons programs, including the Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle. But that decision, made in the context of competing wartime priorities, meant that German infantry in late 1944 faced American riflemen with a weapon that was, round for round, simply superior. The tests at Kummersdorf would quantify exactly how superior. Hoffman suspected he already knew the answer. The testing protocol at Kummersdorf followed a standardized procedure developed over years of weapons evaluation. Every captured firearm underwent the same sequence: static examination, function testing, accuracy trials, endurance firing, and finally, comparative analysis against German equivalents. Hoffman had overseen hundreds of such evaluations. The M1 Garand would receive no special treatment. The technician, a Feldwebel named Kraus, who had worked at the Proving Ground since 1941, began with disassembly. The Garand broke down into 5 major components: the stock, the trigger housing assembly, the barrel and receiver group, the operating rod, and the bolt assembly. Each component was measured, weighed, and examined for manufacturing quality. Machining is excellent, Kraus noted, running a micrometer along the receiver rails. Tolerances are tight, but not so tight as to cause binding with fouling. He worked the operating rod by hand, feeling its movement. The gas system is elegantly simple. Gas bleeds off through a port in the barrel, drives this rod backward, which rotates the bolt to unlock it. He demonstrated the action slowly. The return spring here brings everything forward again. The whole cycle completes in perhaps 0.2 of a second. By comparison, the Gewehr 43, Germany's most advanced semi-automatic rifle, used a more complex short-stroke piston system derived from captured Soviet SVT-40s. It worked, when it worked, but required more careful maintenance and suffered from parts breakage under sustained firing. The Garand's long-stroke gas rod system was almost primitive in its directness, yet this simplicity translated to reliability. The accuracy testing began at 100 meters. Kraus loaded the Garand, seated himself at the bench rest, and fired 5 rounds at a standard target. The rifle's report was sharp, louder than the Kar-98K, and the recoil, while manageable, was more abrupt. He fired the remaining 3 rounds in the clip, and the characteristic ping rang out as the en-bloc clip ejected automatically. Hoffman examined the target through binoculars. The group measured approximately 4 centimeters, roughly 1.5 inches. Respectable accuracy, though not exceptional. The Kar-98K, in the hands of a skilled marksman, could achieve tighter groups. But that wasn't the point. Now, fire as rapidly as you can while maintaining the target, Hoffman ordered. Kraus loaded another clip. 8 rounds downrange in 7 seconds, then another clip. 8 more rounds in 6 seconds. The rhythm was mechanical, almost hypnotic. Load, fire 8 times, hear the ping, load again. A trained soldier could sustain this indefinitely, limited only by how quickly he could retrieve fresh clips from his ammunition pouches. In the time it took Kraus to fire 32 aimed rounds from the Garand, approximately 30 seconds, a rifleman with a Kar-98K might manage 10 rounds, perhaps 12 if he was exceptionally proficient and discarded any pretense of careful aim. The mathematics were brutal and irrefutable. The endurance testing pushed the weapon harder. 500 rounds, fired in strings of 50, with 2-minute cooling periods between strings, then continuous, firing full clips as fast as they could be loaded until the barrel glowed dull red in the afternoon shadows. The Garand never faltered. The bolt continued cycling. The gas system continued functioning. Even with carbon buildup visible around the gas port, the rifle operated. "How many rounds has this weapon fired?" Hoffman asked, studying the serial number in his notes. Kraus examined the bore with a bore scope. "Difficult to say precisely, Herr Hauptmann, but based on throat erosion and rifling wear, I would estimate between 3,000 and 5,000 rounds, perhaps more. 3,000 to 5,000 rounds, through French mud and German resistance, and the weapon still functioned flawlessly. The Kar-98K could match that durability. Mauser actions were legendary for their strength, but the Kar-98K could never match what came next. The comparative trial began at 1,400 hours. 2 riflemen, both experienced marksmen from the Proving Ground's permanent staff, were positioned at adjacent firing lanes. One received the captured M1 Garand. The other, Obergefreiter Zimmermann, a veteran of the Ostfront with a marksman's badge, was given a standard-issue Kar-98K fresh from the Mauser factory at Oberndorf. The scenario was simple. Engage a series of man-sized targets at varying ranges 100, 200, and 300 meters. The targets would appear for 5 seconds, then disappear. Score 1 point for each hit. Continue until 100 rounds had been expended. Hoffman had designed this test personally. It replicated, as closely as possible, the actual conditions of infantry combat: fleeting targets, variable ranges, time pressure. This was not target shooting, this was killing. Zimmermann loaded his Mauser with practiced efficiency, chambering the first round with a smooth bolt manipulation that spoke of thousands of repetitions. His counterpart, Gefreiter Wolf, younger, less experienced, fumbled slightly with the Garand's en-bloc clip before seating it properly. The bolt slammed home with that distinctively different sound. "Begin," Hoffman ordered. The first target appeared at 200 meters. Zimmermann fired. Bolt up, back, forward, down. Fired again. Both shots struck center mass. The target disappeared. 5 seconds elapsed. The next target rose at 100 meters. Zimmermann's third shot struck high. He worked the bolt, adjusted, fired again. Hit. The target dropped. Beside him, Wolf was already pulling ahead. The Garand's semi-automatic action eliminated the physical and mental interruption of bolt manipulation. Acquire target. Fire. Fire again. Fire a third time if needed. No breaking cheek weld. No losing sight picture. The rhythm was fundamentally different, more fluid, more aggressive, more deadly. After 10 targets, Zimmermann had scored 14 hits from 23 rounds fired. Wolf, still adjusting to the Garands' different sight picture and trigger feel, had scored 18 hits from 31 rounds. Not a massive difference, but Zimmerman was sweating, his movements sharp and hurried as he fought to keep pace. Wolf looked almost relaxed. After 20 targets, the gap widened. Zimmerman, 29 hits, 48 rounds fired. Wolf, 38 hits, 62 rounds. Zimmerman's bolt manipulation, expert though it was, couldn't compensate for the seconds lost between shots. More critically, the physical exertion of rapid bolt work was degrading his accuracy. His breathing was labored. His hands trembled slightly between engagements. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the 30th target, Zimmerman had fallen nearly 15 seconds behind in total engagement time. In combat, those 15 seconds represented the difference between suppressing an enemy position and being suppressed by it. The difference between advancing and dying in place. The difference between taking an objective and watching your squad cut down while trying to work bolt-action rifles under fire. "Cease fire," Hoffman called. Final score. Zimmerman had fired 100 rounds, achieving 42 hits on 30 targets, a 60% hit rate, respectable for rapid engagement shooting. Wolf had fired 100 rounds, achieving 57 hits on 30 targets, a 71% hit rate, and he'd finished 90 seconds faster. But these numbers told only part of the truth. Hoffman approached the firing line and picked up both rifles. The Kar 98K's bolt was hot to the touch. Zimmerman's thumb showed a slight abrasion where it had repeatedly grasped the bolt handle. The rifle itself was warm, but not uncomfortable to hold. The Garand's barrel was significantly hotter, the price of sustained semi-automatic fire. But the weapon itself felt ready to continue. No wear. Just a tool that had done its job and stood ready to do it again. Zimmerman spoke quietly, his voice barely audible. "Herr Hauptmann, if we had faced these in Russia." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Hoffman returned to his office as twilight settled over Kummersdorf. The day's test results lay on his desk, typed neatly by his clerk, the numbers arranged in columns that told a story no amount of propaganda could obscure. He lit a cigarette, a luxury growing scarcer by the week, and began drafting his report. The Wehrmacht's reporting requirements were specific. Captured weapons evaluations followed a standard format: technical description, performance assessment, tactical implications, and recommendations. Hoffman had written dozens of such reports. Most concluded with variations of the same recommendation. Weapon offers no significant advantages over German equivalents. Not recommended for adoption. This report would be different. He wrote carefully, choosing words that conveyed the technical reality without editorializing. The M1 rifle demonstrates superior sustained rate of fire compared to the Kar 98K while maintaining acceptable accuracy. Gas-operated semi-automatic action proves reliable under field conditions. Magazine capacity of 8 rounds, while inferior to our 10-round capacity in the Gewehr 43, is offset by the speed and simplicity of the on-block clip loading system. But technical description couldn't capture what Hoffman had witnessed that afternoon. The numbers could: a 50% increase in effective fire rate, a 20% improvement in hit probability during rapid engagement, a 60% reduction in the time required to engage multiple targets. Yet even these statistics failed to communicate the fundamental shift in infantry combat capability that the M1 represented. The American industrial achievement was equally sobering. According to intelligence estimates, Springfield Armory and Winchester together were producing approximately 40,000 M1 rifles per month by mid-1944. Over 4 million had been manufactured since 1940. The United States had not merely developed a superior infantry rifle, they had mass-produced it on a scale that made it the standard weapon for every American rifleman from Normandy to New Guinea. Germany, by contrast, had manufactured approximately 450,000 Gewehr 43 rifles through all of 1943 and 44 combined. The Sturmgewehr 44, potentially even more revolutionary than the Garand, would reach perhaps 425,000 units by war's end. The vast majority of German infantry, perhaps 85%, still carried the Kar-98K. This wasn't a failure of German engineering. The Gewehr 43 was, in many ways, a more sophisticated weapon than the Garand. The Sturmgewehr 44 was a genuine breakthrough in small arms design. But sophistication meant nothing if you couldn't produce the weapons in sufficient quantities to equip your army. The Americans had understood something fundamental. A good weapon in every soldier's hands was better than an excellent weapon in storage. Hoffman stubbed out his cigarette and continued writing. Tactical implications. American infantry units armed with the M1 rifle possess significantly greater sustained firepower than equivalent German units armed with bolt-action rifles. This advantage becomes more pronounced in fluid combat situations, requiring rapid engagement of multiple targets. The psychological effect of sustained semi-automatic fire on defensive positions should not be underestimated. He paused before writing the final section. Recommendations. What could he recommend? That Germany immediately cease production of the Kar-98K and retool for mass production of semi-automatic rifles. Impossible. The industrial capacity didn't exist. The raw materials were needed elsewhere. The time required to implement such a change exceeded the time Germany likely had remaining in this war. Recommendation. Priority should be given to capturing additional M1 rifles and ammunition for issue to elite units. Study of the weapon's gas system may inform future German semi-automatic rifle development. Tactical doctrine should be adjusted to account for American small arms superiority at the infantry level. It was an admission of defeat, carefully wrapped in technical language. The Americans had won the rifle war before most German commanders even knew it was being fought. And that, Hoffman suspected, was perhaps the most devastating lesson of all. Hauptmann Hoffman's report reached the Heereswaffenamt on September 18, 1944. It was read, filed, and ultimately changed nothing. By that point in the war, German military leadership faced problems far more pressing than infantry rifle doctrine. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied armies were advancing through France. Strategic materials were scarce. The industrial capacity to retool for mass production of semi-automatic rifles simply did not exist. But the report did not vanish into bureaucratic oblivion. Copies circulated among ordnance officers and weapons designers. Some reached field commanders, who recognized in Hoffman's careful technical language a confirmation of what their men had been reporting for months. The Americans could maintain a volume of rifle fire that German infantry, no matter how well trained or determined, could not match with bolt-action weapons. Individual German soldiers, when opportunity allowed, drew their own conclusions. Captured M1 Garands appeared in the hands of Wehrmacht troops with increasing frequency in the final months of the war. This was never official policy. The ammunition logistics alone made widespread adoption impossible. But a German soldier who found himself holding an American rifle and a supply of .30-06 ammunition rarely gave it up willingly. The weapon worked too well. The larger significance remained unacknowledged in official circles. To admit that the Americans had fielded a fundamentally superior infantry rifle since 1936, 8 years before Hoffman's evaluation at Kummersdorf, required admitting that German military planning had miscalculated badly. The Wehrmacht's faith in bolt-action rifles, supported by machine guns, had been based on sound tactical principles and proven through years of combat. But it had also been based on the assumption that Germany's enemies would remain similarly equipped. The Americans had broken that assumption. They had made a massive industrial and doctrinal bet on semi-automatic rifles before the war even began, accepting the higher cost per unit and the greater ammunition consumption because they correctly anticipated that their industrial capacity could sustain it. They had been right. By late 1944, virtually every American rifleman carried a weapon that gave him a decisive advantage over his German counterpart in individual firefights. The Japanese, despite their desperate situation, had attempted to copy the Garand. The Type 4 rifle program at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal represented a tacit admission that Japan's bolt-action Arisaka rifles were inadequate against American firepower, but Japanese industrial capacity was even more strained than Germany's. Only 250 Type 4 rifles were completed before the war ended. None saw combat. It was a gesture of recognition without practical effect, acknowledging the problem while lacking the means to solve it. Germany's own semi-automatic rifle programs told a similar story. The Gewehr 41, introduced the same year as Operation Barbarossa, never achieved reliability sufficient for mass issue. The Gewehr 43, which corrected many of its predecessors' flaws, entered production in 1943, but never exceeded 20,000 units per month. The Sturmgewehr 44, potentially more revolutionary than anything the Americans had fielded, came too late and in too few numbers to change the tactical reality at the infantry level. These were not failures of German engineering skill. The Gewehr 43 was, in many respects, a more refined weapon than the Garand. The Sturmgewehr 44 pioneered concepts that would define infantry rifles for the next 50 years. But technical excellence, without industrial capacity to support mass production, was merely an expensive curiosity. The Americans understood that a simpler weapon, produced in millions and distributed to every infantryman, was worth more than a sophisticated weapon, available only to specialists. This was the lesson encoded in Hoffman's report, though he never stated it explicitly. The war would not be won by superior technology alone. It would be won by the side that could equip its entire army with good enough technology. And, in the autumn of 1944, that side was not Germany. The M1 Garand continued its service long after the war that proved its worth. American forces carried it through Korea, where Army historian S.L.A. Marshall praised its reliability in extreme cold conditions that disabled many other weapons. It remained the standard American service rifle until 1958, when it was replaced by the M14, itself essentially an improved Garand, capable of fully automatic fire. Even then, surplus Garands were distributed to American allies throughout the Cold War, arming South Korean, South Vietnamese, and dozens of other armies. This moment, repeated countless times across the Wehrmacht's testing facilities, field headquarters, and frontline positions, represented something larger than a simple technical evaluation. It was the collision between doctrine and reality, between what military planners believed about infantry combat and what actually worked in the mud and chaos of modern war. The Germans had not been wrong to emphasize machine guns as the primary infantry weapon. Their squad tactics, built around the MG-42, were sophisticated and effective, but they had been wrong to assume that bolt-action rifles would remain adequate for the other 8 men in the squad. They had been wrong to believe that semi-automatic rifles were too expensive, too complex, and too ammunition-intensive for mass issue. Most fundamentally, they had been wrong to underestimate American industrial capacity and American willingness to equip every soldier with the best weapon available, regardless of cost. The M1 Garand exposed these errors with brutal clarity. It was not the most accurate rifle of the war. The Kar 98K probably held that distinction. It was not the most advanced. The Sturmgewehr 44's select fire capability represented the future of infantry weapons. But it was good enough, reliable enough, and above all, numerous enough to give American infantry a decisive advantage in the basic work of combat, putting rounds on target faster and more consistently than the enemy. General Patton's alleged, quote, "The greatest battle implement ever devised," was hyperbole of the sort generals favor, but it contained a truth that German officers like Hoffman recognized when they conducted honest evaluations of captured weapons. The M1 was not greatest because it was perfect. It was greatest because it delivered 70% of what a perfect infantry rifle might achieve, and it did so in the hands of 4 million soldiers, from Normandy to Okinawa, in conditions ranging from desert heat to Arctic cold. The lesson transcended the specific weapon. Wars are not won by having the best technology. They are won by having good enough technology in sufficient quantities to equip entire armies. They are won by making correct strategic decisions years before the shooting starts, then having the industrial capacity to implement those decisions at scale. The Americans had done this with the M1 Garand. The Germans had not. By the time Hoffman wrote his report in September 1944, this lesson had already been learned at terrible cost. German infantrymen had learned it in Normandy, trading fire with Americans who could shoot twice as fast. German commanders had learned it in situation reports describing friendly casualties and enemy firepower. Now German weapons evaluators were learning it in the sterile environment of the proving ground, where precise measurements and controlled tests confirmed what the front lines already knew. The M1 Garand did not doom Germany. To defeat that outcome was determined by larger strategic errors, by economic disparities, by the decision to fight a war on multiple fronts against enemies with greater resources. But the rifle embodied those disparities. It was physical evidence, 9.5 pounds of steel and walnut, that America had made better choices about how to arm its infantry. And in war, as in all things, better choices compound over time until they become decisive. That was the truth Hoffman confronted that September afternoon. It was a truth written in test results and firing rates and production numbers, and it was a truth that arrived far too late to change anything at all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.